Welcome to the Core Women Podcast, the place for women entrepreneurs, authors, and self-starters looking to build community and gain valuable insights through expert interviews with women at the top of their game. Join your host, podcaster, producer, expert coach, entrepreneur, and author, Dr. Summer Watson, as she aims to inspire and empower you through these candid conversations. Lean in and embrace the journey. It's time to start the show. Here's your host, Dr. Summer Watson.
Welcome to the Core Women Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Janice Gassam Asare, an organizational psychologist, award-winning author, and founder of BWG Business Solutions. From job coaching at the Coalition for the Homeless to consulting for global brands like Google, Amazon, and Yale, Dr. Asare's work is rooted in one purpose: building workplaces where equity isn't performative, it's powerful. With 3 best-selling books, over 500 Forbes articles, and a new release on the way called Rise and Resist, Dr. Asare helps individuals and institutions confront the uncomfortable truths about power, race, and resistance so they can rebuild cultures where everyone belongs. This conversation is about how we move from awareness to action and what it takes to rise in a moment of rollback. Let's get into this and welcome Dr. Asare.
Hi, thank you so much, Summer, for having me here.
I am so excited. Let's roll right into this. But before we get into your professional journey, if you could describe your life to this point in one word, what would that word be and why is that word meaningful to you?
I would definitely say dynamic. I've gone through a lot of iterations in my life and in my career, and if someone were to look at all of the jobs that I've worked and the career paths I've taken, it would seem maybe disjointed, but I feel like there is like a defining thread that goes through everything, which is just, I think everything I've done is just to ensure people have the best experience as they can in the workplace. And I've worked in so many different industries to do that. So I would say dynamic. And it's because I've had so many ups and downs in my journey.
Oh, I love that word. So thank you so much for sharing your word and sharing why that's important. Now I'm going to move on. What shaped your passion for workplace equity and justice?
Definitely seeing what my parents went through in the workplace. They had a lot of ups and downs. They immigrated to the US from Cameroon, which is a country along the western central coast of Africa. And they had so many issues, just language barrier for my mom. She came here and she didn't speak any English. And so there was just a lot that she experienced. Both of my parents, funny enough, are educators, and I think that I took on the educational mantle from them. And, my dad worked in a university setting and my mom a K through 12 setting. And just watching their experiences really made me want to do something in the workplace. I was always interested in just belonging and racial dynamics as somebody who had to navigate 3 different cultures, right? My parents' culture that I feel removed from. And then once we got here, being a Black person in the country and then occupying mostly white spaces because I grew up in mostly white neighborhoods, went to mostly white schools, went to white institutions when I got to college. So I felt like I was navigating always 3 different cultures. I went to 3 different high schools. So belonging was always something that I was thinking about and was always on the top of my mind. And then watching my parents' experiences, I was like, how do you make sure people have the best experiences? We spend so much time at work. So what does a positive workplace experience look like, and how do we make sure people have those? And I think that's what really influenced me to go into this path.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that is so interesting because, yes, we do have to understand those various cultures and subcultures that we find ourselves in, that we tend to be guided towards or driven towards. So let's get into more of that experience. You've done so much, you've worked so many places, you've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world. What's something people misunderstand about diversity, equity, inclusion in corporate spaces?
I always say representation is not enough. I think it's good to have, right? I think a lot of companies focus on representation because that's the most visible and tangible metric. You can see how many women do you have in your workplace? How many Black people? All of these different demographic
Yeah.
characteristics, but we need to go beyond that. And I think representation is not enough. A lot of tech companies, I always read their tech diversity reports. I think a lot of them stopped putting those out, but for the last 6 or 7 years, a lot of the big tech companies have put out these diversity reports and they share their numbers with us. And what I always notice is that we don't see year over year how many people stayed at the company. They tell us, oh, we increased our senior women in leadership by X amount. And we increased our indigenous employees or our Native American employees by this amount. And we increased this and this. And I'm like, okay, but how many people are those same people that were there previously? Because it's easy enough to hire people. It's much, much harder to retain them and make sure you're giving them the tools to feel supported. So I would say really making sure that you're not just focusing on getting people in the door, but you have actual systems in place and policies that you can point to that support all of the differences that people come into the workplace bringing.
Yeah, I love that point of retention. How many people are actually staying? How many people are actually feeling as if they belong in that system? And those are some really important questions. That's a talk that I did last night. And it's really interesting because there are some really unique dynamics where women tend to stay, but are they staying for the right reasons? And they're staying because they feel like maybe their group will not be cohesive enough if they leave. Maybe they haven't done enough. And they're already out the door in so many ways mentally, but physically they remain. And then once they are gone, they've really already left emotionally way before that. So those are some really great questions, Dr. Asar, because it's who is staying? How are we helping these people with that sense of belonging or those cultures? So let's get into your new book, Rise and Resist. Feels especially urgent right now. What inspired it and why now?
Yeah, so I'm so excited about this book. I started writing it at the beginning of 2025. And the reason I wrote it is because I saw after the 2024 election that as somebody who does equity work, I knew that with the incoming second Trump administration, there was going to be a lot of equity rollbacks, as we saw in the first administration with Trump. And so I created or provided a guidebook. It was just like a 30-page document that I created, and I dropped it on Inauguration Day 2025. And it was like a DEI resistance playbook. And an editor that I had worked with, a senior editor I worked with previously on a book that I wrote called Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, he subscribes to my emails and he got the email where I said, hey, this is a resource. If you need it, it's here. And he's like, you should definitely turn this into a book. Let's explore this. And so he and I talked, and he was like, what are the tools that people can use right now? And I actually said, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and repeat things that have already been said, it's important in this moment for us all to look at history, because I've been thinking a lot last year about like, what did people who lived like 60, 70, 80 years ago that were getting chased down, hosed down, all of these things that had separate water fountains and all. How did those people navigate what they were experiencing? What tools did they have? What strategies did they utilize? And what can we take from their journeys and their legacies? And how can we use that right now? And so the book looks at 32 different Black figures throughout history who have resisted, not just in the US, but globally, and what strategies they used, right? So I talk about resistance behind the scenes, which is something I think is important right now, where people don't need to be so bold and ostentatious with their resistance, especially during times of great opposition. And so there are people who resisted, but in ways that were more covert and that were more behind the scenes, right? And so how can we do that in present day? I also talk about documentation as resistance. I think it's really powerful what people in Minnesota have been doing, where they're documenting what's happening between citizens and ICE. And people are using their cameras and they're exercising their voice and they're sharing what's happening. And so there are many people who've documented the harms that were happening, and we can do those same things. And so I just go through different ways that people have resisted, specifically Black people have resisted, 32 different stories of Black resistance and what that can teach us right now. And I felt like these lessons are applicable to me to any time period, but especially now when there feels like there's a lot of opposition to any sort of justice or civil rights or equity efforts. So that's why I felt like this book was really important, especially right now.
It is so important. You've spoken about how traditional equity efforts often fail employees. You've touched on that a little bit. So I like that what you said kind of rolls into this question. What should companies and advocates be doing differently?
I definitely think, and it's ironic that I'm saying this as somebody who does workplace trainings, but I think trainings, and many people have been saying this for years, are very surface level, right? One training or one conversation is not going to move the needle. And while education is a really important component, and coming from a family of educators, I'm an educator myself. I'm not going to diminish the impact of education, but education is not enough. There has to be changes embedded in the system that ensure that everybody has the tools that they need to thrive. I was having a conversation with a family member of mine who works for the transit system in the DC, Virginia, Maryland metro area. And she was saying that one of the issues that they're facing is that the job descriptions and job postings contain things that aren't really necessary for the job, and they subtly push people out, right? Because
Mhm.
they're nice to haves, but they're not need to haves. And what she's noticing is that there's a lot of candidates of color, candidates of the global majority, who are applying for these roles who don't have all of the credentials, but because they see the job description requires X, Y, and Z, they may be deterred from applying or filtered out by the AI systems. And so that's a systemic issue where the AI systems and the job description are subtly pushing people out who may otherwise be qualified because of these things related to the job that are not really necessary. And so looking through the system and assessing what are the ways within the workplace system that we have policies or practices in place that aren't really inclusive. Even looking at the employee handbook, right? And seeing what are some of the policies that we have in place, like grooming policies and appearance policies that a lot of companies are not inclusive. In one of my books, I talked about how when I came to New York, I worked as a tour guide. So I was one of those people on the double-decker buses showing people around Manhattan and Brooklyn. And a requirement of the job is that I had to wear a uniform, and I had a red polo shirt, a red jacket, and a red hat. And my hair was not able to fit in the hat. And I remember getting reprimanded by my manager because I wasn't wearing the official hat that had the logo. And I was like, well, this is a policy that's in place, but doesn't consider maybe somebody with curly hair or with an afro, or somebody who wears a turban, right? Or who has a hijab. All of these are not considerate of people who may have different hairstyles or different headgear that they have to wear. And so it's really important that when we create policies that they are inclusive of people of different backgrounds and they're really considerate of people's differences.
Well, I think those are all really valid points. My husband was in the military for 21 years, and they're not supposed to have facial hair. But a lot of people's skin, and in particular, Black people, Black men, and their beards, and what shaving every day causes. And so there has to be some thought about those policies because of different skin type, different hair type, what it causes, the treatments, all of that that people have to look at. And that's significant because that's health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you saw that there's a new policy in the military where Pete Hegg said that all men have to be clean shaven. And that is a policy I wrote about where I was saying that this is something that's a systemic issue where Black men are more prone to, getting
Ingrown hairs,
exactly.
various skin issues. Yes, absolutely. And I've recognized that just by being next to my husband and seeing the troops and looking at, not just color, but skin types, but about all these things. Because again, that's something that we look at, right? Is somebody in the field of psychology, is
Exactly.
somebody who studies sociology, right? And so we recognize recognize those kinds of things. And they're important to recognize, just as you were saying about the hat, right? And that's something that people might see as, well, we didn't even consider that, yet it can be simply rectified by putting something into the policies and procedures that, hey, we need to make exceptions at times, right? And so if somebody is in a situation like feeling uncomfortable, feeling like they don't belong, and we're just starting with those conversations, although you said, talking about it isn't the only place we can go with this, but don't you think it's a great start?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that it's necessary, but I think where a lot of companies falter is that that's the only thing that they do, a
Mm,
training, and then they think that things will be resolved or that they can check something off. But I don't want to diminish education and talking is important. Even book clubs, right? I know people kind of diminish the power of book clubs, but people coming together and talking about things that they've read, I think is really powerful. But I think even sharing resources and sharing because you may have somebody who did not see something from a certain perspective, and because they had a conversation with you in an elevator, they now have shifted their perspective or they've widened their understanding. And so I do think that the conversations are important and people, I hope, feel comfortable, but I recognize that not everybody feels comfortable enough or feels like they want to have those conversations, right? So I think I struggle with that. And then I also don't want to put the burden of education on the marginalized person. So I think that that's what happened a lot after 2020, where people felt like, well, my boss sees that I'm the only Latina in this company, and now I'm forced to educate people on everything related to Latin Americans. Or my coworkers see that I'm the only Black person, and now I'm the unofficial head of the DEI committee. And so I think that we can't diminish the helpfulness of education, but that can't be the only thing. But I do think that things start with a conversation.
yeah, absolutely. I think there is importance in conversation. And every group that I'm in, every conversation I have, whether it's person to person or in a group conversation, I think there's a lot of aha moments. Whether you recognize that or there's recognition on somebody's face, maybe they're internalizing that. And they're going to come back to you behind the scenes and say, hey, maybe we should have talked about it in this way. Or maybe I felt uncomfortable. It made me feel this way. Or maybe I didn't even realize or even think of it from that perspective. So those conversations, especially those exchanges, are so helpful in many instances. But you're right, it's a beginning. It's only a beginning because I think with doctors like you, teachers, educators, you're going to help them with the steps. Like your book will help with the steps because they're coming from people all over the world that are talking about what they did, maybe what steps they took. And I think that's where we get lost as educators too. If we leave them, folks that are involved in our conversations in these groups, without potential steps to try or to take, then we failed again.
Absolutely. And I'm not somebody that ever likes to critique something or, talk about an organization or institution without providing what I think are effective strategies and solutions, right? We are in an era right now where everyone has been talking about the Super Bowl halftime show and everyone's been talking about the NFL. And I'm somebody that's not supportive of the NFL as an institution because of the things that they've done and some of their practices, and they have racial discrimination lawsuits. And there's also been a lot of sexism, where a lot of women and journalists and writers have complained about what they experienced from men who are affiliated with the NFL. And so I don't agree with the institution. I had a conversation with someone and they're like, are you going to hate the NFL forever? What do you think they can do as an institution to get better? And I'm like, I have a million ideas of what I think they can do. I think they can make sure that there is safety. I know they've been increasing the padding and the helmet to make sure that players are less likely to get CTE and get injured. I need to see more of that. I need to speak to the head coaches to hear about their experiences. Even though the Rooney Rule is in place, the NFL isn't really sort of abiding by it. The Rooney Rule says that they have to interview non-white candidates for the head coach position, but I don't think they're really doing that. So, like, looking again at their policies and their practices, it's not just getting the representation, but how, when they do have those Black quarterbacks or when they do have those non-white coaches, what are their experiences? Do they feel like they're supported? Do they feel like they can thrive? And so I think that it's important for us to be critical and to critique, but also I don't think it's a productive practice to just critique things without having some sort of ideas or answers that we're thinking about as alternatives or ways to change or transform or fix a system. And so I think that whenever I'm sort of critiquing something, I try to offer some sort of alternatives.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. As we come to the close of the interview, and we've covered so many things here, my last question is for someone feeling discouraged in their workplace equity, what's one small step they can take this week to rise and resist?
I think studying history. History was my least favorite subject in school. I do not like history, but I understand that studying history is so important and will help us get the tools we need in this moment. Look at figures of resistance and revolutionary figures, somebody like Angela Davis, whose story is really powerful and everything she endured and she went through. I'm just like always wowed by her story. So I think reading stories of people who came before us, some people who are still living and how they resisted, because there's always gems and lessons that we can learn. So I think looking to history, if you're somebody who's afraid of what to do in this moment, how do I navigate this moment? Look at somebody who inspires you, who has resisted, and read more about their story and their legacy. And I feel like you will definitely get some sort of inspiration. And of course, not to shamelessly plug, but I kind of distilled that in the book. So I think the book will hopefully provide a lot of people with inspiration in this moment. But I think looking to history can provide you with some inspiration in this moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gassam Asare, for being on the Core Women podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Summer. I look forward to joining you again for more conversations.
I would love that. You can connect with Dr. Janice Gassam Asare on LinkedIn and on Instagram.
Thank you for joining us on the Core Women podcast with Dr. Summer Watson. We're so glad you're here and would love to connect more with you. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Core Women and on Twitter at Core Women 1. For more about Core Women and Dr. Watson, visit corewomen.com. Want more support and resources for amazing women like you? Great! Join Dr. Watson and Jen Fontanilla at the Life, Love, and Money Collective, a Core Women production that aids in understanding the key traits that might be getting in the way of living a life that you are absolutely passionate about. Connect with Summer and Jen and find out more at thelifeloveandmoney.com.